Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be discussing Lesson 8.3 Changing the Workplace. So, we learned in Lesson 1 that businesses grew in Ohio. There were more factories, there were more jobs. So, that's why immigrants came to Ohio. Well, today we are going to talk about the working conditions in these factories and how bad they actually really were. And then we'll talk about some of the things that workers did to fight back for better conditions. During the late 1800s, a few large companies treated workers well, but most didn't. They didn't need to. These large companies didn't need to treat their workers good because there was plenty of workers waiting to take someone's place if he or she quit. So, for example, I'm working in a factory and I don't like it. It's hot, it's crowded, I don't make a lot of money, and I quit. The company will just replace me. And if I complain, they will just fire me. So you kind of just have to live with it at this point. And so workers did. Factory work involved low pay and long hours. The average factory worker worked at least 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. They had no vacation, no sick time, no money if they got injured on the job. So if you were sick, you still had to come in or you didn't get paid. So very long hours, 12, sometimes up to 18 hours a day working in a factory, 6 to 7 days a week. Men made about $500 per year. That's $500 per year. And women who worked in factories made half of that. So about $250 per year. Even with inflation, it would only be about $10,000 in today's money, which is not a lot. It was not enough to live off of. And that is why most families needed everyone to go to work. Men, women, and children had to work in factories so that they were able to have enough money to survive. So factory work involved a low pay and long hours. There were also factories called sweatshops. And sweatshops were factories where workers are paid low wages and work in unhealthy conditions. So look at the photo of this sweatshop. Look how many people, no windows, no air conditioning. Some sweatshops had women and children working 80 hours a week in dangerous, hot, and crowded conditions. So women and children worked sometimes 80 hours a week in these sweatshops. Not only did they have no vacation, no sick time, they didn't receive any money if they were injured on the job. Usually they would just be replaced. They had no health care benefits, which means they had no health care insurance. Children did the same work as adults but were paid less. So, like I said, because of the lack of money, men, women, and children in the family had to work. And companies liked to hire children because they could pay them less than an adult. And children got paid on average 27 cents 27 cents a day after working 14 or more hours. 27 cents a day after working only or 14 or more hours. Can you believe that? Children as young as 5 years old. So you right now could be working in a factory during the late 1800s in Ohio. Now, the Ohio government tried to fix some of these problems, but oftentimes employers, right, so those who hired these children would ignore the laws passed to protect children. So the employers just said, we're not going to listen to you, government. And so they did. All right, so just a few review things about this part. Factories were dirty, hot, crowded. They had faulty equipment, which means equipment that did not work, which would cause injuries. I mean, you had children put their arms into machines to fix them, and they would lose their entire arm in the machine because it was faulty. In the late 1800s, specifically 1882, there was an average of 675 workers killed each week in factories. 675! So these conditions were terrible for factory workers. Not only factory workers, but those who worked in sweatshops and those who worked in mines. And remember, mines are underground tunnels to find natural resources like gold or coal. So what did these workers do to improve their situations and to better the working conditions? Again, they found it difficult to speak out because they could be easily replaced. So instead of one person speaking out, they had to find a way for a group of people, because you can't replace everyone. It's very difficult. And workers formed labor unions to deal with bosses and improve pay, hours, and safety. So workers created these labor unions, and a labor union is a group of workers who organize to make agreements with their employers. So all these different types of workers came together. So if you were a glassmaker, you had a union. If you were a miner, someone who worked in the mines, you had a union. If you were a steel worker, there was a union for you. All right. If you were an iron worker, if you were a potter, all these groups, all these occupations, all these jobs had unions. All right. And these unions were created to deal with the bosses of these big companies to improve workers' pay, to decrease worker hours, and to improve worker safety in these conditions. And so there were two major unions created in Ohio during the late 1800s. There was the American Federation of Labor in Columbus, And the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, worked to increase wages, so increase the amount people were paid, shorten the working hours, and to put an end to child labor. All right, the AFL worked to end child labor. There was also a union called the United Mine Workers, which helped mine people who worked in the mines to get better wages, for improvements in safety, and for shortened hours as well. So they all had the same goal. They were just working for their group of workers based on their, so like the United Mine Workers, they fought for miners in Ohio, for those who worked in mines. And so members of labor unions would go on strike if the bosses would not agree to make changes. And a strike is refusing to work if their demands were not met. So if you look on the drawing, the illustration on the page with the train, this was a railroad strike in the Southwest, and those who worked on the train and for the train company refused to work until their demands were met. And you see, sometimes these strikes sometimes they were peaceful, and bosses would eventually agree to their demands, but sometimes they were violent. Like in this drawing, the boss hired people to beat up the workers on strike. So they became violent. Some strikes became violent. Ohio had nearly 1,000 different labor unions by 1900. So that's a lot. So think about 1,000 different labor unions, 1,000 different groups of workers fighting for better working conditions in Ohio. And we still have unions today. The photo on the bottom of the page is a strike with teachers in a school in Ohio. They were on strike to get better working conditions for themselves and their students. So, I hope you learned a little bit more about the working conditions and the improvements made in working conditions in Ohio during the late 1800s. Now you can move on to your next assignment.